Well, hello everyone, and welcome to First Baptist Church of Crystal River and our Wednesday evening Bible study. Tonight's Bible study will be coming from my home to your home. Unfortunately, last Wednesday when we went to record it at church, we ran into some technical difficulties. So tonight's Bible study will continue. The setting will just be a little bit different. So as you're watching this evening, if you have your Bible, I just want to give you a heads up that tonight we're going to look at Acts chapter 19, verses 23 through 41. And that will bring us to the conclusion of Acts chapter 19. Well, as I get started this evening, just wanted to give everybody a little bit of a review in terms of where we are. This is in the middle of Paul's third missionary journey that begins in chapter 18 and will conclude in chapter 21. Most of Paul's third missionary journey is spent in the city of Ephesus. He remains there for 3 years. In fact, Paul remains longer in Ephesus than any other city that he visited on his missionary journeys. And so the focus of this particular journey is what happens in Ephesus. Just a little review of that. Paul encountered some false religion. There was the story of the 7 sons of Sceva, who had the false notion that simply saying in the name of Jesus was enough to cast out a demon. So they tried it without actually being a Christian, without actually knowing Jesus personally. For them, the phrase was simply a magic formula. And for the demon, it was a reason not to be cast out, but a reason to attack. And so these 7 men get beat up, and they run from the house naked, totally humiliated. And because of that, respect and fear come upon the city. And then at the end of that story in verses 18, 19, and 20, many of the Ephesian Christians who used to dabble in magic, and they had scrolls of magic spells, and these were very expensive. Any type of writing back in the first century was incredibly expensive, but they had these scrolls, and they decided that following Jesus and following magic just don't go hand in hand. So they decided, we're going to follow Jesus, and we don't need these magic books anymore. So they burned them, and at great personal sacrifice to themselves. They were expensive. They could have sold them for a lot of money. They were able to say to Jesus, we are following you and following you only. And then we looked last week at Paul's determination to go to Jerusalem and also to the city of Rome. Paul's been in Ephesus for 3 years. He realizes it's time to leave. It's time to go somewhere else. And Paul's going to make his way to Jerusalem, hoping to eventually make it to Rome so he can preach the gospel in the capital of the Roman Empire. Well, tonight we're going to look at a story about Paul and the craftsmen of Ephesus. And that story is in chapter 19, verses 23 through 41. The Christians were willing to burn their magic books. They were willing to sacrifice for the cause of Christ. But there are some craftsmen in Ephesus who are losing money because of Christianity. These craftsmen sell statues of idols, and people would buy them, and we're going to find out they were making a lot of money in this business. But as more and more people in Ephesus become Christians, they stop buying statues. Once they become Christians, they realize, I don't need a statue. I'm following Jesus Christ. I'm worshiping the God of heaven, and I don't need to bow down to a statue anymore. So they're no longer buying these items, and the silversmiths are losing money. And nobody likes it when they're losing money. In fact, the silversmiths decide to demonstrate against the Christians, to try to get the Christians in a lot of trouble because of this. So the story in verses 23 through 41 falls into 3 categories, 3 sections. We have the instigation of a riot by a silversmith named Demetrius. Then we have an uproar that takes place in the theater. And finally, the silencing of the crowd and a resolution to this issue. a question is raised as to why does Luke present this story? And one of Luke's main purposes in writing the book of Acts is to show that Christianity is not a political threat against the Roman Empire. Christians are not organizing and having secret meetings trying to overthrow the Roman government. That's not what Christians are doing. It's also important to keep in mind that the Roman government has already given freedom of religion to the Jewish people. And that was part of the agreement years ago between the Jewish people and the Roman government. Because at the time, the Greeks were trying to force the Jewish people into worshiping Greek religion. And the Jewish people eventually rebelled. The Jewish people got their freedom for a while, but then they decided that there's this up-and-coming empire, the Roman Empire, and if we can side with them against the Greeks, then the Romans will protect us, so that if the Greeks happen to send in the big army, we would be protected. And part of that agreement with the Romans is that the Jewish people would have freedom of religion. And one of the things that Luke wants to point out is that there's a lot of similarities between the Jewish religion and Christianity. In fact, Christianity comes right out of the Jewish faith. And since the Romans have given freedom of religion to the Jewish people, they ought to give freedom of religion to the Christians as well. And so that's going to be Luke's point. And he also wants to point out that if there's a case against the Christians, it ought to be taken to court, where both sides have an opportunity to defend themselves. It should not be taken to the streets and public demonstrations that stir up riots. In fact, Luke wants to make the point that Christians are not in favor of riots. And riots are very important to the Romans because the Romans hated riots. Basically, Rome had two regulations that people needed to follow. Number one, pay your taxes. And number two, don't cause a riot. And as long as you paid your taxes and did not cause a riot, Rome basically left you alone. And all of these self-governing cities could remain self-governing as long as riots were not taking place. And Luke makes the point that Christians are absolutely against riots. They are in favor of an orderly process of law. And that's what Luke wants to say to his readers in this story. Well, let's take a look at the story. And it begins in verses 23 through 27, talking about the instigation of a riot by a silversmith named Demetrius. Verse 23 says, "About that time there arose a great disturbance about the way." About that time refers to the fact that Paul is ready to leave. He's ready to leave Ephesus. He's ready to make his journey toward Jerusalem. But before that happens, this disturbance, this story takes place. And this disturbance is going to concern the way, which back in the first century, that was the name for Christianity. Today we call ourselves Christians, followers of Jesus. Back then in the first century, Christians were called the followers of the way. And several times in the book of Acts, Luke will refer to the Christian movement simply as the way. Well, what was the disturbance? It's in verse 24. "A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in no little business for the craftsmen." The business of Demetrius was that he was a silversmith, and he would make statues. And right there in the city of Ephesus was this incredible temple to Artemis. This temple was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And visitors would come from all over the Roman Empire just to visit that temple. And of course, if you are a tourist, you're a visitor, you have to take a souvenir home with you. And one of the souvenirs was a silver shrine of that temple. And people would buy them, take them home, use them for their private worship. And as Demetrius says, we made no little business. In other words, we're making quite a bit of money off of this particular business. And part of it was simply the temple. And the temple was in many ways the center of life for the city of Ephesus. It's an incredible temple. It's 165 feet by 345 feet, and it's built on a platform of 240 feet by 420 feet. It's a huge structure. And right there in the temple is this enormous image of Artemis. Artemis is her Greek name. Diana is her Roman name. And according to mythology, she is the daughter of Zeus. And Zeus is at the very top of the pantheon. He's the chief god. Artemis is also a sister of Apollo. So she's a very important goddess for the Greeks and the Romans. Basically, Artemis was a virgin goddess. She was the goddess of hunting. And often you'll see her depicted with a bow and arrow about to go out and hunt. However, her story gets combined with the story of a fertility goddess from Asia. And because of that, now Artemis is also the mother goddess. She is the fertility goddess. And so this huge statue, this huge image of her is found in her temple. And it's a rather interesting design. In fact, you can Google this and look this up, some of the ancient statues of Artemis. It's a massive image with a veiled head. She has animals and birds on her head and lower body because she is the mother goddess. She is the goddess of the living. She also has numerous breasts from her waist to her neck. Which in ancient times, to depict a goddess of fertility, you depicted her by giving her many breasts. And that's the way this particular statue looks. Because of that, she's the goddess of nature. Her goal is to protect and preserve the fertility of all living things. In other words, Artemis is very important to the city of Ephesus. So much so that people would give lavish gifts to Artemis every time they visited her temple. And because of that, the temple becomes the major financial institution in the province of Asia. They have a lot of money, and a lot of banking transactions take place at her temple. So it is big business. So when Demetrius talks about the fact that we bring in no little business, he wasn't kidding. That temple was the center of everything that happened in the city of Ephesus. Then in verse 25, Demetrius called them together, the other silversmiths, along with the workmen in related trades, and said, "Men, you know we receive a good income from this business." And so again, he's emphasizing the fact that they make a lot of money. Now, Demetrius is most likely the leader of the silversmith guild. He might be their president. He's certainly a leader in the community. And at this point, he wants to appeal to the populace to side with him against the Christians. Now, Demetrius could say, the issue is we're losing a lot of money because of these Christians. But a lot of the people in Ephesus would say, you're already making a lot of money. So, don't be crying poor mouth to us. We know you're rich already. So that's not going to work. So Demetrius is going to appeal to religion and also to patriotism to try to stir up the crowd in his favor against the Christians. So Luke wants us to know, however, this isn't about patriotism. This isn't about religion. It's about money. Demetrius is apparently quite greedy, and because of the Christians, idol sales are falling in Ephesus, and Demetrius is concerned. And in verse 26, he explains why. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced many and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that man-made gods are no gods at all. And that was the message of Christianity, that gods and goddesses, the stories are not true. that idols do not have any life, that there's only one God, the God of heaven, and he's the one who has life in himself. So the problem for Demetrius and others is that when people became Christians, they stopped buying statues. And when they stopped buying statues, it hurt the financial business of the silversmiths. And apparently, there's a large number of people in Ephesus and throughout the province of Asia who are becoming Christians. Christianity is growing, and it's hurting the bottom line of the silversmith business. It's an economic threat to them. In verse 27, basically Demetrius is going to give his best political speech. Now, there's a bottom line to the whole thing, and it's money. But notice how Demetrius wants to portray his business and his thinking. There is danger, not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. So Demetrius wants everybody to understand this just isn't about me. This is about all of us, and it's about our great goddess Artemis. Because of these Christians, she may lose her fame. Because of them, people may stop coming to Ephesus, which means everybody's going to lose money. And not only that, but Ephesus is the guardian of the great temple of Artemis. It's a symbol of pride in our city. So to attack Artemis is to attack the city. To attack Artemis is to attack us. So we're all involved in this. We all stand to lose because of what these Christians are doing. And again, Demetrius is giving his best political speech. But Luke wants us to understand that the bottom line is not about his piety, it's about his pocketbook. Demetrius really isn't leading a religious riot, he's leading an economic panic, his own economic panic. The real issue for him is he's losing money, and nobody likes to lose money. Well, the next section is the uproar that takes place in the theater. And we find that in verses 28 through 34. Verse 28 says, when they heard this, when they heard Demetrius' speech, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The political speech worked. The people get furious. They're fired up. They're ready to defend their city. They're ready to defend their goddess. They're ready to defend their pride. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And so they began chanting this as a way to show their support. And then in verse 29, soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and rushed as one man into the theater. So apparently there's a procession that takes place from the Silversmith Guild all the way to the theater. And as the procession is taking place, they're shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And other people begin to join them. Most people may not know why they're even joining this particular parade and potential riot, but they do. And they make their way into the theater. Now, back in the first century, if you were to have a public meeting, the open-air theater is where the meeting would take place. And it just so happens that the theater in Ephesus has been excavated by archaeologists. And this is a massive structure. You think back, this is the first century. And this particular theater could seat 25,000 people. To kind of put that in perspective, some of our baseball stadiums and football stadiums pre-COVID could seat 50,000 people or 100,000 people. Well, this was a pretty big-sized open-air theater that could seat 25,000 people. Some of the dimensions, it's 495 feet in diameter, and it's built into the western slope of Mount Pion. So they built this into a mountainside, and it's a huge structure. In fact, you can Google this, and there's several pictures of it. It's absolutely fascinating to me what these ancient people were able to build. But this is an incredible structure, and the people of Ephesus took great pride in their theater as well. Now, scholars are a little bit divided over whether what's about to take place is going to be an official meeting of the city or just an ad hoc gathering of a bunch of protesters and rioters who want to stir up trouble. For the most part, scholars think that this is just an ad hoc meeting that has legal status. So, however, they're looking for the Apostle Paul because he's the one they want to accuse. Apparently, they can't find him. So they grab a couple of his buddies, Gaius and Aristarchus, both from Macedonia. Apparently they became Christians under Paul's ministry. They're now helping Paul in the ministry, and they happen to be available for these protesters to grab and drag into the theater. Verse 30 says is that Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, and the disciples would not let him. Well, eventually Paul hears about it. What's all this commotion taking place in town? Well, it happens to be the silversmiths, and they are basically saying, Paul, they're looking for you. They're angry with you because of what you're teaching and the fact that they're losing money because of your ministry. And in the mind of Paul, he's thinking, this is a great opportunity to share the gospel. I mean, there could be as many as 25,000 people in that theater, and I'll just get up in front of everybody and give a speech and eventually share the good news of Jesus with 25,000 people. And that's what Paul is thinking. The Christians, his friends, are thinking something different. Paul, this is a riot. This is a mob. Not only will you not be able to give a speech, but if you walk into that theater, chances are you're not going to walk out alive. They will tear you from limb to limb. So, Paul, the best advice we can give you is to stay out. Stay in hiding until all of this is done. In fact, verse 31 points out that even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. So Paul is friends with what's called the Asiarchs. These are leading people in the city. This is the wealthy class. They hold positions of high power within the city or within the province. And Paul has a great reputation with many of them. They've become friends, and they send a message to Paul basically saying, don't go into the theater. Stay out because you're not gonna survive if you walk in to that mob. I think there's a great lesson for us in verses 30 and 31. Many times we try to fix things. We'll pray about a matter, and then we'll try to fix it. We'll be like Paul. We want to take center stage. We want to put in our 2 cents. We want to get involved and influence people. But many times the smartest thing we can do, the best thing we can do, is to stay out of it and let God resolve it. And that's exactly what these people were telling Paul to do. Paul, don't go into the theater. Don't put in your 2 cents. Don't try to influence anybody. Just stay out of it and let God handle it. That's difficult to do, isn't it? It was especially difficult for Paul. I mean, every impulse that he had was telling him, go into that theater and proclaim the gospel. And people had to beg him not to do that. There are many situations in life when things would turn out better if we simply prayed about it, if we give it over to God, and then stay out of it. As this story turns out, it's going to end positively for the Christians in a very big way. But if Paul had walked into that theater, it would have not turned out great for the Christians. A terrible scene may have taken place. People may have lost their lives. Things may have gotten completely out of hand. It could have been an absolute disaster if Paul got involved. Sometimes the best thing we can do is stay out of things and let God resolve them His way. Verse 32, the assembly was in confusion. And this is why there's a huge mob of people in the theater, and many of them are confused. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. That's a pretty good description of a church business meeting, isn't it? Some were shouting one thing, some were shouting something else, and most people didn't even know why they were there. Well, I'm kidding, but this is a mob scene that takes place, and people aren't even aware of what's going on. They simply joined the mob as it was walking down the street. Now they end up in the theater, and they're asking each other, what's this about? What's going to happen here? Because they don't even know. In verse 33, the Jews pushed Alexander to the front, and some of the crowd shouted instructions to him. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. Now, this is fascinating that the first person to stand up and want to give a speech happens to be a Jewish man named Alexander. And some of his friends push him to the front, and some of them give him instructions about what to say. It could be that Alexander really didn't want to do this, but he just got pushed into it. But there's a problem here. This scene involving Alexander is not going to help the situation at all. Alexander is Jewish. Jewish people and Christian people have some things in common. They worship the God of heaven, they don't worship Artemis, and they don't buy statues. So for Alexander to get up and speak is not going to solve the issue even a little bit. In fact, with Alexander standing up and wanting to give a defense, many of the people there may have thought that he was the instigator of the whole thing, that he was the one that everybody was angry with. So he motions for silence, which was very common back then. It was one of the forms of rhetoric. Before you gave a speech, you would motion for silence, and everyone would respect you, quiet down, and give you attention. Well, that's the way it's supposed to work. But remember, this is a mob. This is a noisy crowd. And so Alexander's not going to get the response he's hoping for. Verse 34, but when they realized that he was a Jew, they shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." In the minds of these Greek people and Roman people, Jews and Christians were pretty much the same. They had those things in common. They don't worship Artemis. And so for Demetrius to have a Jewish person stand up, he doesn't want to hear from the Jewish perspective. And the Jewish perspective may have been, they wanted to say to the people of Ephesus, we're not associated with those Christians. So whatever you're accusing those Christians of, that's not us. We're not with them. That may have been what Alexander wanted to say, but in the minds of the worshipers of Artemis, if you're a Jew, you don't worship Artemis. If you're a Christian, you don't worship Artemis. So they don't want Alexander to say anything. So they literally shout him down for 2 hours, yelling, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So the rally, the riot, the pep rally continues. Well, beginning in verse 35 is the silencing of the crowd and the resolution of this issue. Verse 35 says, the city clerk quieted the crowd and said, "Men of Ephesus, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image which fell from heaven?" Alexander is not able to quiet the crowd, but the city clerk is able to quiet the crowd. The city clerk just so happens to be the chief executive officer of the city. He presides over the city magistrates, the public assembly. He's the liaison between the city and the Roman provincial government. He holds a very high position in the city. We could call him a mayor, but that may be a little too diluted of a title. This particular man has a lot of political power over Ephesus. And he is thinking, we've got a problem here. And the problem is the people are in uproar, and all of my bosses who are Romans don't like riots. So if this riot continues, I could lose my job. And Ephesus is a self-governing city, and we may lose that privilege because of the riot. So this city clerk has a very important agenda. He needs to quiet the crowd, and he needs to disperse the riot before anything nasty or terrible takes place. So to pacify the crowd, he assures them that these Christians are in no way diminishing the majesty and the respect and the beauty of their goddess Artemis. He talks about the fact that the people of Ephesus are the guardians of the temple. They're the guardians of her statue, and they take great pride in that. And the city clerk says nothing's going to change that. And then he says, alluding to a story about Artemis, that her image fell from heaven. Now, Paul had been saying that images made with human hands are not gods or goddesses at all. But according to this particular tradition, the statue, the image of Artemis, was not made by human hands. It fell from heaven. It fell from Zeus. So Paul cannot be talking about the image of Artemis in our great temple because it was not made by human hands. It fell from the sky, kind of like a meteor. It just kind of fell to the earth, and there it was, and we placed it in the temple. So he wants to assure them that nothing's going to happen to the worship of Artemis. It will continue as before. Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to be quiet and not do anything rash. The city clerk is a man of law and order. Having public demonstrations and riots is not the way to conduct business. You need to conduct business orderly. And everybody knows the story of Artemis. And so there's no reason to get upset. There's no reason to do something that we're all going to regret later. You have brought these men here, talking about Gaius and Aristarchus, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed the goddess. The idea of robbing temples could be literal. They didn't go into the temple of Artemis and steal something or break something or destroy something. It could also be figurative. Robbing the temple means robbing of its honor, its respect. So in other words, these Christians are not disrespecting the temple. Neither are they disrespecting or blaspheming our goddess. And it could be that the city clerk is giving the Christians the benefit of the doubt here. Obviously, Christians are not worshiping her. They're not buying her statues. They're persuading people to stop worshiping Artemis and worship Jesus instead. But at the same time, the Christians are not standing on the street corners with signs degrading the goddess. They're not leading any public demonstrations against her. They are simply believing what they believe. And just as the Jewish people had freedom of religion, the Christians are practicing their faith. And by doing that, they're really not interfering with the worship of Artemis. The city clerk goes on to give Demetrius and his friends some legal options if they want to press charges against the Christians. Starting a riot is not a good way to press charges. If you want to press charges, you need to take it to court. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. So for a private lawsuit, you would simply take it to court. And there would be magistrates there who would hear both sides and render a verdict. So if Demetrius has a case against Paul, he can take Paul to court. And the magistrate will hear both sides and render a verdict. At the same time, in verse 39, if there is anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. At this point, he's talking about not just private lawsuits, but public lawsuits. If there's a lawsuit against Christians that involves the whole city of Ephesus, it needs to be brought before the public assembly, which is why most scholars believe that this was not what was happening in Ephesus. This was more of an ad hoc riot that was taking place. It was not a legal assembly. And again, the city council wants things done decently and in order, because that's the Roman way to do that. So, if Demetrius thinks that Paul and his Christian friends are hurting the city, he needs to bring it up in the public assembly. As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting, and that's the big issue for the city clerk because of today's events. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion, since there is no reason for it. Back in verse 27, Demetrius brings up a charge against Paul and the Christians that they are presenting a danger to Ephesus by downgrading the worship of Artemis, by not buying statues, by not worshiping the goddess. They are putting the city of Ephesus in danger. But notice the irony. In verse 40, the city clerk points out that it's not the Christians who are putting the city of Ephesus in danger. It is the silversmiths and the rioters who are putting the city in danger because they could be charged with rioting. And for the Romans, that was a major offense. Again, it could mean that the city officials would lose office. It could mean that they would lose their right to self-govern. And so it's interesting at this point that the city clerk says the Christians are not guilty of breaking any Roman law. They are not guilty of any wrongdoing. The Christians are innocent. The guilty party in this whole thing is Demetrius. And wow, the whole thing just flipped at the end. And this is very important because this city official, this high-ranking city official, has just said that the practice of Christianity doesn't break any Roman law. And because of that, Christians should be given freedom of religion. And that's pretty much what happens. In Ephesus, in the province of Asia, Christians are given freedom from persecution, which means they're able to spread their message far and wide, and thousands of people become Christians in that province because of it. Fighting for freedom of religion was something that Christians did in the first century. And again, the Jewish people were given freedom of religion. And Luke's point is that Christians should be given that same privilege. Later on, as we make our way through the book of Acts, Paul's going to argue, and Luke's going to argue as the writer, that Christianity comes out of Judaism. And in the Roman mindset, When they looked at what the Jews believed and what the Christians believed, there were so many similarities that they really couldn't tell the difference. And really, the main difference is that Christians believe that Jesus is the Messiah. The Jewish people did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And the Romans looked at that and said, sounds to me like this is an internal argument within Judaism. You people ought to solve that yourselves. But for us Romans, we don't want to get involved in your religion. You settle the issue and we want nothing to do with it. And when they made those kinds of conclusions, Christianity had freedom of religion. Finally, in verse 41, after the city clerk had said this, he dismissed the assembly, and everybody went home. So he's able to protect the city. Nothing bad happens to the city. From what we know, Demetrius never presses charges against Paul. All of this ends up being settled in favor of the Christians. And again, if Paul would have gotten involved in this, it may not have ended up this way. There are times when we just need to stay out of things and let God work things out in our favor. The first century Christians had to fight for religious freedom. We are very blessed in our country to have religious freedom in our Constitution. Let's never take that for granted. Many Christians in our world today do not have freedom of religion. Many of them are basically meeting in private. They're meeting underground. They're meeting in places where they hope they'll never be discovered. But we have the wonderful privilege on Sunday and Wednesday of walking into a church building and worshiping and bringing praise to Jesus Christ, and it's protected under our Constitution. We are very blessed to have that. And again, the first century Christians had to fight for their religious liberties. And because of decisions like that made by the city clerk, for the most part, Christians had freedom of religion for a while. Freedom of religion ended for Christians when Nero became the Roman emperor. And you may have heard the story of the Great Fire of Rome, which most scholars believe that Nero was responsible for setting that fire. But Nero needed somebody to blame, and he ends up blaming Christians. And because of that, this horrible, unspeakable persecution takes place against Christians. And it's amazing to me that Christianity survived that. But by the grace of God, it did. But freedom of religion is a very valuable thing, something that we should never take for granted and always be thankful for. Well, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. And hopefully the next time we have Wednesday night Bible study, you can watch the Bible study as it's recorded at church. So let me say to you, until we meet again, either in person or online, let me encourage you to stay safe, and may God bless you.